May 12, 1943. Norfolk, Virginia. Feldwebel Kurt Zimmerman, a sunburned Afrika Korps veteran who'd survived 3 years of desert combat on half-rations, stepped off the Liberty ship expecting American cruelty. Instead, merchant sailors, ordinary workers, not soldiers, ate thick steaks and ice cream while loading German baggage onto Pullman railroad cars with cushioned seats. His commanders had sworn America was weak, divided, barely able to feed its own people. The railway car had clean windows and working toilets. Kurt's hands trembled. If this is how they treat enemies, what do they give their own people? The train rolled into Hearne, Texas on May 15th, 1943, 3 days after leaving Norfolk. Kurt Zimmerman pressed his face against the Pullman window and saw nothing but flat farmland stretching to the horizon, no bomb craters, no destroyed bridges, no refugees choking the roads. Just endless fields of cotton and corn under a sky so clear it hurt his eyes. After 3 years fighting in North Africa, where every supply convoy was a desperate gamble, this peaceful abundance felt like stepping into a dream someone else was having. Camp Hearne sprawled across 720 acres north of town, a grid of 250 temporary buildings divided into 3 main compounds. Each compound held 50 structures surrounded by double rows of 10-foot barbed wire fencing, 1,800 miles of wire total, enough to stretch from Texas to Chicago and back. 7 guard towers punctuated the perimeter. But what struck Kurt wasn't the security. It was the cleanliness. Fresh white paint, neat gravel paths. Electric lights burning in broad daylight like electricity cost nothing. The American lieutenant who processed Kurt's intake papers explained the rules in careful, practiced German. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, Article 26, he said, sliding a mimeographed sheet across the desk. Same food rations as United States Army soldiers, same medical care. If you are enlisted, you work for 80 cents per day in camp scrip. If you are non-commissioned officer, you do not work. Recreation facilities, library, sports equipment provided." Kurt stared at the paper, reading the words twice to make sure he understood. The same food as American soldiers. He'd watched those merchant sailors eating steak in Norfolk. If prisoners ate what soldiers ate, and soldiers ate like that, then— "You think this is trick," the lieutenant said, not unkindly. "You think we fatten you for something worse. I understand, but this is not trick. This is law. International law. You will see." The barracks were simple but functional, wooden beams covered with black tar paper, mineral-surfaced roofs, concrete floors. 8 men to a room. Each bunk had a real mattress, not straw, not canvas, but cotton-filled fabric that compressed under Kurt's weight like a luxury hotel bed. Running water in the lavatory building. Flush toilets. Hot showers. Kurt turned the shower handle and clean water cascaded out, as much as he wanted for as long as he wanted. In North Africa, he'd gone weeks without enough water to wash his face. At 1800 hours, the dinner bell rang. The mess hall could seat 400 prisoners. Kurt filed in with his compound, took a metal tray, and joined the serving line. An American cook, a private, just an ordinary soldier, ladled food onto his tray without comment, without contempt, without anything except professional efficiency. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in brown gravy, green beans glistening with butter, 2 thick slices of white bread, real butter, not margarine, apple pie, coffee with cream and sugar, a glass of cold milk. Kurt carried his tray to a table and sat down. Around him, other Afrika Korps veterans stared at their plates in silence. Some had tears running down their faces. One man, a sergeant from Munich named Franz, who'd been captured the same day as Kurt, picked up his fork 3 times and set it down again without eating. "It's poisoned," Franz whispered. "It must be." But Kurt was already eating. The chicken was tender, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. The potatoes were smooth and rich, better than anything his mother had made even before the war. The bread was soft inside, crispy outside, still warm. He ate, slowly at first, then faster, then with desperate speed, shoveling food into his mouth until his stomach cramped from the sudden abundance. When the meal ended, American soldiers collected the trays. Kurt watched one guard scrape half-eaten chicken and untouched bread into a garbage can. Another dumped mashed potatoes, pounds of them, into the trash. Food that would feed a German family for 3 days, thrown away like it meant nothing. That night, Kurt lay on his cotton mattress in the dark Texas barracks and did mathematics that made his head hurt. He'd received approximately 3,600 calories that day. He knew this number because he'd spent years calculating rations in the desert, trying to make 1,200 calories stretch. Wehrmacht soldiers in Europe were getting 1,980 calories daily as of winter 1943, and that number was dropping. German civilians were down to 1,400, sometimes less. His mother's last letter, dated March, had mentioned eating potato peels and calling it soup. America was feeding its enemies better than Germany fed its soldiers. Franz's voice came from the bunk above. The lieutenant said this is every day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, all like this. I know. 3 meals, every day. Real meat, real bread. I know. Silence. Then Franz said the thing they were both thinking. Kurt, if they feed prisoners like this while fighting a war across 2 oceans, how much do they have? How much can they make? Kurt had no answer. But the question kept him awake long after the barracks lights went dark. His commanders had sworn America was weak, divided, barely able to feed its own people. But Kurt had eaten better tonight than he had eaten in 3 years of service to the Reich. He'd showered in hot water, slept on a real mattress, been treated with efficiency and indifference rather than cruelty. The mathematics didn't lie. You couldn't fake abundance this complete. You couldn't trick 5,000 prisoners spread across 3 compounds into believing they were eating well if the food wasn't real. And if America could afford to give this much to prisoners, to enemies who'd been trying to kill Allied soldiers just weeks ago, then what did it have for its own armies? What resources could it throw at Germany? For the first time since his capture, Kurt Zimmerman felt something worse than defeat. He felt certainty. Germany had entered a war it could never win. Not because of tactics or strategy or the courage of soldiers, but because somewhere across the Atlantic, his country was starving while America threw away enough food to feed a city and called it routine waste from a single meal. 6 months passed. Kurt Zimmerman gained 23 pounds between May and November 1943. He played soccer, attended English classes, ate 3 meals a day without fail. The food never diminished. The portions never shrank. American soldiers ate like kings, and prisoners ate exactly the same. But November 25, 1943 changed everything. The Americans called it Thanksgiving, a national holiday celebrating abundance. Kurt had learned about it in English class. Americans set aside 1 day each year to give thanks for what they had. Germans celebrated victories, not prosperity. But celebrating food, it felt obscene when he thought about his mother's letters describing potato peel soup. The mess hall had been decorated with paper turkeys. The tables wore white tablecloths. American guards wore dress uniforms. Something important was happening, but Kurt didn't understand what until the first serving trays emerged from the kitchen. Turkey, not chicken. Turkey, a massive bird roasted until the skin turned golden brown. The smell filled the mess hall, rich and savory, making Kurt's eyes sting. The cooks carved the birds at serving stations, thick slices of white and dark meat, juice running across the cutting boards. Kurt took his tray forward. The portions were obscene. 8 ounces of turkey, more meat than a German family received in a week. Mashed potatoes drowning in gravy. sweet potatoes topped with melted marshmallows, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls with butter, and dessert, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, plus apple pie. Kurt sat. Around him, 400 German prisoners stared at their plates in silence. The mess hall, usually filled with conversation, had gone quiet enough to hear the ventilation fans humming. Franz, sitting across from Kurt, picked up his fork and set it down. His hands shook. "This is what they feed their families? All of them?" Kurt nodded. He'd asked the guard. The man had laughed, actually laughed, and said every family in America was eating this meal today. Every single one. Millions of families. Not because it was special officer privileges, but because it was Thursday. Thanksgiving. This was just what Americans did. The mathematics made Kurt's head spin. If every American family was eating like this, what did that mean about productive capacity? How much food could America grow, process, transport, and still have enough left over to feed 425,000 enemy prisoners the same meal? Someone started crying. Kurt looked down the table at a sergeant from Stuttgart with tears streaming down his face, a bite of turkey halfway to his mouth. The man wasn't making noise, just sitting there with tears falling while he chewed mechanically, swallowing food his family would never taste. Kurt cut into his turkey, tender, seasoned with sage and thyme. The meat fell apart under his fork. It tasted better than anything he'd eaten in his life, and that fact made him want to throw the plate across the room. This was enemy food, fed to him by a nation that should have been struggling. But there was no struggle here, only abundance so complete it felt like mockery. After dinner, Kurt stood outside watching American cooks scrape leftovers into garbage cans. Pounds of turkey, whole pies, uneaten rolls. The waste from this single meal would have fed his mother for 2 months. The cooks joked with each other while they worked, laughing about eating too much. It was routine. It meant nothing to them. Kurt pulled out his notebook and wrote in careful German, "The Americans celebrated a holiday by feeding enemy prisoners like nobility. If every American family was eating the same meal, America is not a country but a paradise." He stared at the words. They felt dangerous, like admitting defeat, but they were true. A country that could feed 130 million people a feast, plus 425,000 prisoners, plus millions of soldiers fighting across 2 oceans, that country wasn't fighting for survival. That country was so wealthy, it could afford generosity that looked like insanity from Germany's perspective. That night, Kurt did the mathematics. Single Thanksgiving turkey, 8 ounces per prisoner. German monthly meat ration, 4 ounces per civilian. One American holiday meal exceeded an entire month of German rationing. Multiply that by 130 million Americans. 3 meals per day, every day, not just holidays. Add millions of soldiers overseas. Add hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The numbers proved American industrial dominance. You couldn't fake this level of abundance. You couldn't create the illusion of unlimited food for 425,000 prisoners across 700 camps unless the food actually existed in unlimited quantities. And if America had this much food, if agriculture and distribution networks could support this consumption during wartime, then what did its weapons production look like? Its steel mills, its aircraft factories. Franz's voice came from the darkness. Kurt, do you think Germany knows about this? Kurt thought about intelligence officers who compiled reports and sent them up the chain of command. They must know. Someone in Berlin must have calculated American production numbers, understood what they were facing. Yes, Kurt finally said. I think someone knows. I think they've known for a long time. Then why? Because admitting it would mean admitting we've already lost. And no one wants to be the officer who tells Hitler the truth. Outside, Texas stars shone through clear night sky, undimmed by blackout curtains, by smoke from burning cities, by industrial collapse. America's lights blazed, its farms produced, its factories ran day and night. And somewhere in Germany, Kurt's mother was eating potato peels and calling it a meal. Kurt closed his eyes and tried not to think about the pumpkin pie. January 1944, Kurt Zimmerman stepped off a transport truck at the Campbell Soup Facility in Camden, New Jersey, 1,500 miles from Camp Hearne. The Geneva Convention required POW labor to be non-military, agriculture, food processing, light manufacturing. American guards accompanied them, but after 8 months of compliance, the rifles stayed shouldered. This was routine. The factory stretched 4 city blocks. Steam rose from roof vents. Loading docks hummed with trucks arriving, departing, forklifts moving pallets in continuous motion. Kurt had worked in a Bavarian food processing plant before the war. That entire facility would have fit inside this building's loading area. The plant manager, Collins, walked them through orientation using an interpreter. Production target, 10 million cans daily across all facilities. Camden plant, 2 million cans per 8-hour shift, 3 shifts, 24-hour operation. Kurt did the mathematics. 2 million cans per shift, 3 shifts, 6 million cans daily from this single building. The numbers seemed impossible until Collins led them onto the factory floor and impossibility became machinery. The production line stretched 400 feet. Tomatoes arrived via railcar, entire freight cars dumped into receiving hoppers. Conveyor belts carried them to automated peeling machines processing 5,000 tomatoes per hour. No hand labor. No workers with knives. Just machinery running at speeds that blurred tomatoes into red streams. Collins checked Kurt's paperwork listing his pre-war occupation as factory technician. "Quality control," he said through the interpreter, handing Kurt a clipboard. "Check every 100th can. Any defects you mark here. Rejected cans go to secondary market or animal feed. Animal feed? Rejected cans, perfectly sealed, fully edible soup, fed to livestock because minor dents made them unsuitable for retail sale." Kurt thought about his mother's last letter describing how she'd traded her wedding ring for turnips. Germany fed people with potato peels. America fed its pigs with perfectly good soup. The production line operated with mechanical precision. After peeling, tomatoes entered massive steam cookers processing 50 gallons per batch. Automated stirrers, mixed in spices, measured by weight scales connected to timing systems. The mixture moved through heat exchangers, into vacuum sealers, then to canning stations sealing 200 cans per minute. The factory never paused, never slowed, never stopped, except for shift changes. Werner, the former Hamburg professor, said quietly in German, "We had machines like this before the war. Small ones. For specialty production." "I know," Kurt replied. "The Americans have them during the war. Bigger ones. Running day and night. Their war production exceeds our peacetime capacity." The observation hung heavy between them. If America ran factories like this for soup, food that civilians bought freely in stores, what did its military factories look like? Its aircraft plants? Its shipyards? Collins walked Kurt through quality control. Every 100th can got inspected. Rejected cans went onto a separate conveyor to bins marked secondary use. By mid-shift, Kurt had watched 150 cans rejected. Not unsafe, not inedible. But retail standards demanded perfection, and anything less became pig feed. Kurt pulled one rejected can from the bin, small dent on the side, seal intact, label slightly crooked. This single can contained more tomato product than a German civilian received in a week. and it was trash. Garbage deemed unworthy of American stores. During lunch break, a full hour with hot food provided free, Kurt sat with Werner in the employee cafeteria. Through windows they watched more trucks arriving, rail cars positioning for unloading. The logistics network feeding this factory operated with the same efficiency as the production lines. Someone in Berlin must have seen facilities like this, Werner said, stirring sugar into his coffee, real sugar, freely available. Must have calculated production rates. Kurt nodded. Time Zone 5, Colonel Galen, Colonel von Renner. They delivered reports in November 1943. And Hitler ignored them, because admitting American industrial capacity means admitting defeat. Werner stared into his coffee. How long have we known? Since 1943, at least. German intelligence assessed that a single American corps receives more fuel and ammunition than entire German armies. We've been fighting a war we mathematically cannot win. The cafeteria felt too warm, too bright, too full of American workers laughing and eating real sandwiches. Germany's leadership had known. They'd received intelligence reports, seen production statistics, understood the capability gap. And they'd chosen ideology over arithmetic. That afternoon, Kurt watched the factory produce 2 million cans in 8 hours. He calculated backwards. 6 million cans daily from Camden. 10 million across all Campbell facilities. 300 million monthly. 3.6 billion annually. And that was just soup, one company, one food category during wartime. American food production had increased 32% over pre-war levels, despite 6 million farm workers leaving for military or factory work. 20 million Victory Gardens produced 8 million tons of food. Home canning hit 4.1 billion jars. Agricultural exports climbed from $517 million in 1940 to $3.2 billion by 1946. America wasn't just feeding its population and military. It was feeding Allied armies across 2 oceans, feeding prisoners, exporting through Lend-Lease, and still producing surplus enough to waste millions of cans on cosmetic defects. The shift ended. Kurt's hands smelled like tomatoes and industrial soap. His notebook contained quality control forms documenting 150 rejected cans. His mind contained mathematics that made sleep difficult. Germany couldn't win. Not against a nation running 24-hour production schedules for soup and rejecting dented cans. The gap wasn't just military. It was systemic, foundational, impossible to overcome. Time 0.5s. America created abundance through industrial efficiency that would seem insane to a nation eating potato peels. That night, Kurt wrote, "Saw the factory that will defeat us. Not tanks, not aircraft. A soup factory making 6 million cans daily while Germany cannot feed its people. We lost this war before we started it." March 1945. Kurt Zimmerman stood on a scale in the Camp Hearne medical barracks and watched the needle settle at 178 pounds. The American doctor noted the number without comment. When Kurt had been captured in May 1943, he'd weighed 126 pounds, emaciated from 3 years of desert warfare on declining rations. In 22 months as an American prisoner, he'd gained 52 pounds. "You're healthy," the doctor said through the interpreter. "Blood pressure normal. No malnutrition. Teeth improved since last checkup, 3 cavities filled, 1 infection cleared." Kurt thought about the irony. He was an enemy soldier held behind barbed wire, yet he received better medical care than German civilians. Better than Wehrmacht soldiers at the front. The camp infirmary had penicillin, sulfur drugs, sterile equipment, X-ray machines, trained staff. It was cleaner than the hospital in his hometown. Around camp, the story repeated. Werner had gained 61 pounds. Franz, 48 pounds. Medical records documented it. Average weight gain across all 425,000 German POWs in American camps ranged from 45 to 60 pounds over 2 years. One prisoner from Munich arrived weighing 119 pounds and departed at 183, a 64-pound increase. The physical evidence was undeniable. You couldn't fake health. The weight was real, the dental work was real, the medical care was real. And it proved what Kurt had known since Thanksgiving 1943. America was feeding prisoners as routine administrative function while simultaneously feeding 130 million civilians, 12 million soldiers, and supplying 36 allied nations through Lend-Lease. But not everyone in camp wanted to accept that reality. Hugo Kraus learned this the hard way. Kurt had met him. In January 1944, a 25-year-old corporal who'd grown up in New York City before his family returned to Germany in 1938. Kraus spoke perfect English, read American newspapers, understood the production statistics. And he'd made the mistake of saying out loud what Kurt only wrote in his journal: "America is winning the war. Germany cannot win against this industrial capacity." The Nazi true believers in camp, officers who still wore party pins secretly, who held clandestine meetings and enforced ideological discipline, didn't tolerate such talk. In March 1944, Hugo Kraus was found dead in the compound latrine. The American investigation concluded accident. The German prisoners knew better. Kraus had been murdered by his own countrymen for speaking truth. Kangaroo courts operated in darkness, enforcing silence through violence. At least 8 to 10 documented murders occurred across the POW camp system. Internal surveillance was so effective that an American officer later testified there was more political freedom in the German army than in an American prison camp. Kurt learned to keep his journal hidden, to speak carefully, to discuss mathematics only with Werner and Franz in whispers. Because recognizing American industrial dominance wasn't just accepting defeat, it was questioning the ideological foundation that had led Germany into this war. And questioning ideology could get you killed by your own side. The letters from home made the contrast unbearable. Kurt's mother had died in January 1945. Her final letter, arriving in March, described eating tulip bulbs. Daily civilian rations in Germany had fallen to 1,000 to 1,200 calories. Malnutrition was epidemic. Children were stunted. The elderly were dying from hunger-related diseases. And Kurt, the captured enemy soldier, was eating 3,600 calories daily and gaining weight while his mother starved. The survivor's guilt was crushing. American POW rations, 3,600 calories daily. German soldier rations by winter 1944-45, 1,670 calories. German civilians, 1,000 to 1,200 calories. His mother's last meals, tulip bulbs, potato peels, boiled grass. 1 month of American POW rations contained more nutrition than 3 months of what his mother had available. Werner found him outside the barracks one April night. "You heard about the Ruhr?" Werner asked quietly. Kurt nodded. American and British forces had encircled the Ruhr industrial region. 325,000 German soldiers surrendered. Germany's industrial heart was gone. Production capacity eliminated. The war was ending, everyone knew it, but Hitler refused to surrender. German cities were being bombed to rubble. Civilians were dying. And still the fighting continued. German intelligence knew in November 1943, Kurt said. Colonel Galen calculated it. Colonel von Renner documented it. Mathematical proof of inevitable defeat. They sent reports to Hitler. And he ignored them. Worse, von Renner was executed in 1944 for connections to the assassination plot. Maybe recognizing we couldn't win made him desperate enough to try removing Hitler. The mathematics had always been simple. American industrial production in 1943, 85,898 aircraft versus German 24,807, 3.5 times advantage. Tanks, 60,973 American versus 19,926 German over the entire war, 3.1 times. Ships, 124,000 American versus 1,000 to 2,000 German. Between 60 and 120 times advantage. America produced more trucks, 2 million, than Germany produced total military vehicles of all types. Every category showed the same overwhelming American advantage. And German leadership had known. They'd received intelligence reports, seen production statistics, calculated the mathematics. And they'd chosen to fight anyway, sacrificing millions of lives to delay an inevitable conclusion that careful analysis had revealed in 1943. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The announcement came over camp loudspeakers in German and English. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in stunned silence. Nazi diehards refused to believe it. But most prisoners felt something more complicated than grief. Relief mixed with guilt. Certainty that suffering was finally ending, poisoned by knowledge of how much had been lost. Kurt stepped on the scale one final time. 178 pounds. Healthy. Well-fed. 52 pounds heavier than when captured. He thought about Hugo Kraus, murdered for speaking truth. About his mother, dead from starvation while her son ate turkey dinners. About Colonel von Rohen, executed after delivering reports proving Germany's defeat. About 425,000 German prisoners who'd witnessed American abundance firsthand and would return home carrying that knowledge. The weight of evidence wasn't just physical. It was mathematical, industrial, undeniable. Germany had lost to a nation so wealthy it could afford mercy. In February 1946, Kurt Zimmerman stepped off a transport ship at Bremerhaven and saw Germany for the first time in nearly 3 years. The port was rubble, buildings reduced to skeletal frame, cranes twisted into sculptures by bombing, streets cleared just wide enough for trucks through mountains of debris. The air smelled like brick dust and decay. The American soldiers processing repatriation were efficient, professional, indifferent. Kurt received travel documents and 200 Reichsmarks that would buy almost nothing. The soldier stamped his paperwork. Good luck! The train to Bavaria took 3 days instead of 8 hours. At every stop, Kurt saw hollow-eyed people trading possessions for food, women selling jewelry for potatoes, children begging. Daily civilian rations had stabilized at 1,000 to 1,550 calories, enough to prevent mass starvation, but not enough for health. Kurt arrived in his hometown, weighing 175 pounds, 49 pounds heavier than when captured. His neighbors stared at him like a ghost, not because they thought he was dead, but because he looked so healthy. His mother's neighbors told him about her final months. Trading everything for food, eating tulip bulbs, potato peels, grass soup, dying slowly from malnutrition. You look well fed, one woman said. Not an accusation. Just an observation. Kurt's health proved what they suspected. American prisoners had eaten better than German civilians. Kurt couldn't describe Thanksgiving turkey dinners to people eating 1,000 calories daily. Couldn't talk about Campbell's soup factories producing 10 million cans while they stood in ration lines. Couldn't mention gaining 52 pounds while his mother starved. The knowledge sat in his stomach like lead. But he wasn't alone carrying that knowledge. Werner returned to Hamburg. Franz to Munich. 425,000 former POWs spread across Germany, all healthier than the civilians they'd left behind, all witnesses to American productive capacity. Quietly, in conversations with neighbors and relatives, the truth spread. They fed us 3 meals a day. Real meals. They had factories running 24 hours, making soup. I gained 57 pounds as a prisoner. My family was starving. The Marshall Plan announcement came in June 1947. Secretary of State George Marshall outlined a program to rebuild Europe. 13.3 billion over 4 years, 1.4 billion to West Germany. Soviet propaganda denounced it as imperialism, claiming America would use reconstruction aid to control Europe. But 425,000 former POWs knew better. They'd seen American wealth firsthand. They understood America didn't need to take anything from Germany. America already had everything. The aid wasn't exploitation. It was the same abundance that had fed prisoners turkey dinners. Kurt attended a town meeting in late 1947 where residents debated accepting Marshall Plan assistance. Soviet sympathizers argued it meant dependence. Nationalists claimed humiliation. Then Werner stood up and said something that changed the room. I worked in an American soup factory. They produced 6 million cans per day. They threw away perfectly good cans because of minor dents. I watched them waste enough food to feed our town for a year. They didn't do this because they were special. They did it because their system, democratic capitalism, industrial efficiency, mass production, creates abundance instead of scarcity. We can learn from that. Or we can starve because we're too proud. Someone asked, "What happened to your mother while you were gaining weight in Texas?" Werner's face went pale. She died. January 1945. Starvation. Mine too, Kurt said quietly. We all lost someone while we were eating American food. But learning from that doesn't dishonor them. Rebuilding Germany, using the methods that defeated us, that's the only way their deaths mean anything. West Germany accepted Marshall Plan aid. Former POWs became disproportionately represented in post-war manufacturing leadership. They'd seen American assembly lines, automated production, quality control systems. They applied those lessons to rebuilding German industry. Volkswagen adopted American mass production techniques. BMW implemented standardized parts. Food processing companies modeled themselves on Campbell's soup. The results became the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. West German GDP grew 8% annually through the 1950s. Industrial production exceeded pre-war levels by 1958. Living standards climbed from survival to prosperity in a decade. And underneath it all, 425,000 former POWs applied knowledge gained in American camps to construct Europe's most successful post-war economy. Kurt opened a food processing plant in 1952. Small operation, canned vegetables for regional markets. He used automated peeling machines, steam cookers, conveyor systems, miniature versions of what he'd seen in Camden. By 1960, his factory employed 200 people and distributed throughout Bavaria. October 1983. Kurt Zimmerman returned to Camp Hearne as a 68-year-old visitor, not a prisoner. The camp had been preserved as a historical site. He stood in the reconstructed mess hall where he'd eaten turkey on Thanksgiving 1943 and finally answered the question that had haunted him for 40 years. If this is how America treats enemies, what does it give its own people? The answer had rebuilt Germany. America gave its people the same abundance it gave prisoners, and that generosity proved more powerful than any weapon. 425,000 German POWs returned home as witnesses to a different kind of strength, the strength to share, not conquer. They became architects of West Germany's economic miracle, applying lessons learned on Texas factory floors and New Jersey assembly lines. The turkey dinners weren't propaganda. They were proof. America won the war not just with steel and fire, but with something Germany never understood until too late, a system that created so much wealth it could afford mercy toward enemies. Kurt Zimmerman died in 1992, 50 years after stepping off that Liberty ship in Norfolk. He weighed 175 pounds to the end, 49 pounds heavier than the starving soldier who'd expected cruelty and found paradise instead. His final words, recorded by his grandson, answered the question one last time. America didn't defeat us with weapons. America defeated us with Thanksgiving dinner, and then it taught us how to cook.